Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Across Africa, our weekly look at stories from across the continent. I'm Georgia Calvin-Smith, and this week, Chad's president of 3 decades dies of wounds on the front lines of a battle with rebels. There are concerns that Idriss Déby's death could lead to local and regional instability. Also, more than 20,000 people fled the Mozambican town of Palma after it was captured by Islamist insurgents back in March. It was retaken by the army, but the militants remain a threat, and locals' flight southwards continues. And a major step forward for the protection of women and children in Gabon, as customary marriages are finally recognised by the state. Most unions in the country are informal, leaving many women vulnerable. But first, Chad's president Idriss Déby has been killed battling rebels in the north. News of his death came just hours after he was declared the winner of elections, which would have given him another 6 years in power. The 68-year-old led the country for 30 years and was one of the continent's longest-serving rulers. He survived several rebellions and coup attempts whilst heading up a military regime. Despite his autocratic rule, he was a key ally to Western nations in the fight against extremism in the Sahel.
He was one of Africa's longest-serving leaders, having racked up 3 decades in power. Chadian President Idriss Déby ruled his country with an iron fist, but was also a key Western ally in the region against the threat from Islamist militants. Forces from Chad, considered some of the best on the continent, have fought jihadists in northern Mali alongside former colonial power France since 2013. As president and a career military officer, Déby never hesitated to visit soldiers on the battlefront. Last year, he was promoted to Field Marshal. Because of this, Déby managed to keep a lid on international criticism of his autocratic regime. Déby began his career in the army in the 1970s when Chad was going through a long-running civil war. He threw his support behind the president, Hissène Habré, and rose through the ranks until he became commander-in-chief of the armed forces. In 1990, Déby seized power from Habré, leading a rebel army against a man later convicted of human rights abuses. Instead of ushering in democracy, though, Déby led a military regime, rubber-stamped by regular elections, while crushing growing dissent over the worsening economic and political situation. Chad is oil-rich, but Déby's government has squandered hundreds of millions of petrodollars. 66% of its population live in severe poverty. Transparency International lists Chad as one of the most corrupt countries in the world. Over the years before his death, Déby faced a number of challenges to his rule. After surviving numerous coup attempts and rebellions, the insurgents finally caught up with him, aged 68.
More than 20,000 people fled the Mozambican town of Palma after it was captured by Islamist insurgents back in March. It was later retaken by the military, but the rebel threat remains and the flight to the south continues. Many have headed to a town called Pemba, bringing with them the mental and physical scars of the often brutal attack. Our team sent us this report.
Pemba's stadium is packed full of displaced families. Many arrived by boat from Palma, even though soldiers had seized the town back from insurgents. Rumours of further extremist attacks led more people to flee in panic.
I didn't see the insurgent, but there was a lot of movement and agitation in all the surrounding villages. We were told that the attackers were getting very close to town, so we decided to leave.
And Fate could not go on living in fear. His 16-year-old son disappeared during fighting in March and hasn't been seen since. And Fate fled Palma with his wife and 3 remaining children. He hopes that his son will not be forced to join the insurgents. Survivors say children are kidnapped during every terrorist attack, both young girls and boys. This woman lost her 3-year-old nephew when the insurgents briefly took control of Palma.
My uncle was with his wife and another couple. His wife was carrying his son. They tried to hide, but the insurgents found them. They let them go, but they kept the baby.
More than 40% of those who have fled Palma are under 18. One organisation that helps feed the displaced expects their numbers to grow.
We do things locally. We don't just sit with our arms folded. The country cannot manage by itself. We will never be able to do enough. If the international community can help us, it will be welcome.
There are close to 1 million displaced people in the north. A tax spur started in 2017 and the region remains volatile.
Cameroonian authorities are worried about Pentecostal churches in the country in which worshippers are being encouraged to flout social distancing measures. There are fears that the houses of worship are the sources of super spreader events as the country struggles with a second wave of infections. Our team tells us more.
Filled with spirit, a woman goes into trance while the pastor preaches. Worshippers gather for service at a revival church in Yaoundé. Those attending pay little attention to social distancing measures. They have been convinced that they are immune to COVID-19.
Nous sommes des chrétiens. Nous pensons à une chose qui est vraie, que c'est Jésus-Christ qui guérit. Nous pouvons prendre des médicaments. Nous pouvons prendre des cures, et des cures, et des cures de médicaments. Mais il y a une seule chose. Après avoir pris ces médicaments, c'est Jésus-Christ qui guérit.
The congregation is passionate about Reverend Asila. He has been the lead pastor of this Pentecostal church for more than 3 years. Cameroon is currently battling a spike in coronavirus infections. Nevertheless, the pastor uses the same towel to touch and bless Christians. He acknowledges the risks.
Ce serait une hérésie de dire que ni moi qui suis homme de Dieu, ni les fidèles ne seront pas touchés par coronavirus. Personne n'est à l'abri de quoi que ce soit, mais c'est Dieu qui nous protège. Mes fidèles sont un peu plus protégés que les païens.
A false claim shared by many pastors. There are over 350 revival churches in the country. They continue to hold large religious gatherings in defiance of government rules and regulations. The minister responsible for churches and religious groups has threatened to sanction these churches.
Lorsqu'un pasteur vous dit le Covid n'existe pas, lorsqu'un pasteur vient bluffer en disant qu'avec de l'eau bénite, par lui-même, il peut guérir le Covid. Je trouve que c'est extrêmement dangereux. Je crois que ces gens-là, ils ont leur place en prison et je leur donne, c'est le dernier avertissement que je leur donne.
Cameroon has just received its first doses of coronavirus vaccine. The second wave of COVID-19 in the country has been deadlier than the first.
In Rwanda, independent journalists are increasingly turning to YouTube. Channels such as Real Talk or Pax TV welcome politicians from all sides. However, their willingness to give a platform to controversial or dissenting voices has led to more scrutiny from the government. Our team has more.
Chers téléspectateurs de Pax TV, nous vous saluons et aujourd'hui nous sommes avec le Dr Christophe. C'est un nouveau politicien.
John Williams Ndwale is a journalist who runs a YouTube channel on which he often broadcasts interviews with controversial figures.
Here in Rwanda, opponents are not well received in the mainstream media. They are not well received at all. When we talk to political opponents or people who want social economic change, often the Rwandan government sees us as an enemy of the state.
John embraces his right to freedom of speech. However, it has not come without cost. In 2014, he was forced to flee Rwanda after releasing a report that authorities did not like. Today, unlike many YouTube journalists, he has press accreditation. The Rwandan Media Council says that reporters who mainly operate on social media often break the law.
For example, we see cases where privacy is not respected. We see cases of slander. These types of abuses are committed by YouTube users. The viewers do not know how to distinguish between the work of a professional and the work of an amateur.
Operating in a grey legal area leaves YouTube journalists particularly vulnerable to crackdowns by authorities.
We have had bloggers being summoned, YouTubers being summoned by Rwanda Investigation Bureau to explain on some issues on some of their postings. Again, in this kind of framework, it's quite challenging especially when their status as YouTubers is not fully protected by the law.
Human Rights Watch says at least 8 YouTube news reporters in Rwanda were threatened, arrested and hauled before the courts between 2020 and early 2021.
Gabon has legalized customary marriages. Although most unions in the country are carried out according to long-held traditions, they were banned in 1963 and so were not recognized in law. That left women and children vulnerable as they didn't have rights to property or inheritance. Rights activists have welcomed the change in the status of customary weddings. Regina Sondo has more.
A few weeks before their customary marriage, Jacques and Nashida go through a list of gifts for the bride's family at their home in Libreville. They've been together for 2 years.
Les housses, les couvre-lits, les quelques seaux et les haches aussi.
According to tradition, loincloths, liquor, among other items are on the list of gifts for Jacques' parents-in-law. The list was traditionally determined by the bride's background, with no limit in the amount for the dowry. But the Gabonese law has now capped the maximum amount for dowries to 1.5 million francs CFA, or 2,200 euros. Jacques, who spent almost all of his savings for the event, is relieved.
Si la dot revient à 1,5 million, ça nous arrange parce qu'après le mariage, il y a une vie. Il va falloir qu'on s'organise après ça. Le mariage coutumier, il est très coûteux.
The absence of legal framework in customary marriages deprived women and their children of their rights, like inheritance or recognition in case of separation or death.
Elle s'est retrouvée à la rue sans rien.
Thousands of women have found themselves in this situation. Women's rights activists have continually denounced the practice. They have gathered to discuss the new law.
C'est une réponse aux cris de détresse lancés par les femmes. C'est également un gain sur le plan patrimonial parce qu'au moins on sécurise le patrimoine des gens qui ont décidé de se mettre ensemble par amour.
But for this family law specialist, the legalization of customary unions does not fully frame the principle of the dowry to how wives remain indebted with the dowry in case of divorce, unlike civil marriages.
Le problème de la dot, c'est que tant qu'on ne rembourse pas la dot, on reste marié. On reste marié et physiquement et spirituellement. Qu'est-ce qui se passe dans nos us et coutumes? Il faut rembourser la dot pour que les choses reviennent à la normale.
The customary marriage law will be officially enacted in the coming weeks.
Well, that's it for Across Africa for now. Thanks for joining us. Do so again if you can. Take care.